Today on the program, Ukraine Today. The American sanctions that have come into force create a risk that dozens of tankers carrying Russian oil will be stranded at sea. The command of the Russian Federation is sacrificing soldiers for the sake of urgent reports. People from the occupied territories of Ukraine are being sent by the Russians into meat grinder assaults. Excellent news is related to the supply of weapons to Ukraine. President Zelensky and Macron have signed a defense agreement. Scandals and panic over the so-called Trump and Putin peace plan for Ukraine. A number of senators from both parties in the US Congress have criticized the peace plan. In Europe, Trump's aide Witkoff was advised to see a psychiatrist. Poland is preparing for war with the Russian Federation. I've gathered for you the most important and significant news about Russia's war against Ukraine from the past week. My name is Yulia Kort. Good evening. An agent from the partisan movement Atesh, who is part of the 110th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces, reports that mobilized soldiers from the occupied territory of Ukraine's Luhansk region have begun arriving in the unit. They are being sent straight to the Pokrovsk direction without any training. 4 have already deserted after learning they were being sent on local assault missions where only a handful survive. The Russian Federation's command is sacrificing soldiers for the sake of urgent reports and under the open field. When assault operations intensified, many groups went into positions without proper reconnaissance due to command demands to show results as soon as possible, which led to significant losses among personnel. According to reports, the commanders of these units are deliberately taking such actions under pressure from higher leadership and in a rush. As a result, many groups ended up in areas dominated by Ukrainian forces. These cases once again demonstrate the command's disregard for the safety of their own soldiers. For the leadership of the Russian army, achieving results at any cost is what matters, regardless of the number of human casualties. Guliapol is one of the largest cities, and fighting in the city is not the same as fighting in the steppes. There are many shelters here, and it is much more difficult to drive the enemy out of a populated area than from open ground. A number of military targets have been successfully struck in occupied Crimea. This was reported by the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. As a result of the operation on the temporarily occupied peninsula, enemy targets were successfully hit. These included a K-27 shipborne multi-purpose helicopter as well as radar stations. On the night of November 22nd, residents of occupied Crimea heard explosions in Simferopol, Armyansk, Gvardisk and Krasnoperekopsk. According to preliminary information, drones struck an electrical substation in Krasnoperekopsk. This electrical substation is of great importance for the entire peninsula. It receives and distributes electricity throughout the region. In addition, in Krasnoperekopsk, one of the local enterprises with significant strategic importance for the Russian occupiers may also have come under attack. Let's now take a look at what is currently happening on the front lines and around them at this very moment.
The chief of the General Staff of the occupying forces, Gerasimov, reported to Putin about the capture of the city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. According to the Kremlin general, the Russian West Group is also fighting for Kucherivka, Kirilivka and Kupiansk-Uzlovyi, actively advancing toward Krasny Lyman.
The units of the West Group have liberated the city of Kupiansk and continue to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces formations encircled on the left bank of the Oskil River. The offensive is developing successfully in the Rubtsovsk and Krasnoliman directions.
The lies about the capture of Kupiansk are very similar to the so-called seizure of Pokrovsk. A year ago, Russian generals were talking about capturing this city in the Donetsk region. 3 weeks ago, Putin himself invited journalists to come there, and to this day, Pokrovsk, just like Kupiansk, remains under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Gerasimov himself is reporting that Kupiansk has been taken, but in reality, Kupiansk has not been taken, and this is confirmed not only by sources in Ukraine, but also, for example, by the Institute for the Study of War, which refuted General Gerasimov's claim. Well, there's nothing new about this. This is typical lying by Russian generals.
The information about the capture of the city was also denied by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces.
The leadership of the terrorist state continues to stage cheap informational provocations. In particular, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, Gerasimov, reported to the Russian government about the alleged complete capture of the settlements of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region and Yampol in the Donetsk region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reports that Kupiansk remains under the control of Ukraine's defense forces. Counter-sabotage operations and special actions continue in the city and its surroundings to search for and eliminate enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups that have infiltrated the city.
The 7th Air Assault Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces notes that the enemy is being forced to deploy reserves as its forces are becoming depleted.
The defense forces are holding certain lines in the northern part of Pokrovsk. We also control positions south of the railway, which are important for further deoccupation. The enemy is trying to cross the railway to expand the occupied area of the city, but our troops are blocking these attempts. The enemy forces in Pokrovsk are being worn down. As a result, the enemy is forced to replenish its personnel losses. The Russian command has already deployed the operational reserve of the Center Group units of the 76th Air Assault Division of the Russian Federation in our area of responsibility.
Unfortunately, these reserves, although of low quality, still outnumber the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces several times over.
It's no secret that throughout the entire war, the enemy has had a significant advantage in manpower. If during the period of 2020, this was not so noticeable because at that time the advantage was about 1.5 times and then it grew to 2 times. Now the enemy surpasses us in manpower, at least on our section of the front, by various estimates by 3.5 to 4 times. Dmitro Filatov, commander of the 1st Separate Assault Battalion named after Dmitro Kotsiubailo.
In Mirnohrad, the Ukrainian armed forces also have the situation fully under control. The clearing of enemy infantry is being completed. Out of desperation, the Russians are striking Mirnohrad with FAB bombs, but this does not yield the desired result. Despite enormous losses, the Russians are trying to infiltrate in small groups both into Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk as well as the surrounding areas of these cities. But these attempts are being strictly suppressed. The Russian army has made minor advances in the Zaporizhzhia and the Dnipropetrovsk directions due to their advantage in infantry, which is currently very significant. The Ukrainian armed forces simply do not have enough personnel on the front lines.
The last few days have brought Ukraine excellent news regarding weapon supplies. Long-range missiles, Terrahawk Paladin anti-aircraft systems, and that's far from all. More information is coming up in the report.
Even more aid and support, the German Chancellor has promised to equip the Ukrainian army with long-range weapon systems. But Merz did not disclose details about the number of missiles or the delivery timelines.
For months, we have been working intensively with the Ukrainian government on implementing long-range fire projects, as we technically call them. The Ukrainian army will be equipped with such weapon systems.
At the same time, the Chancellor refused to answer a question about Germany's previous reluctance to supply Ukraine with Taurus long-range cruise missiles. He described this approach as a tactic to increase pressure on the aggressor country Russia.
The possibility of operating the Taurus missiles directly depends on the overall level of training and expertise of the technical personnel involved. That is, apparently, the main point is that only Bundeswehr servicemen are currently able to use the Taurus missiles. Furthermore, training Ukrainian specialists for this task will require quite a long period of time.
Germany is the largest European donor of military aid to Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, the government has provided Ukraine with assistance totaling more than 50 billion euros. In September, Berlin launched a new initiative to procure long-range drones jointly with Ukraine's defense industry. Germany will also allocate an additional 150 million euros to purchase weapons from the US for Kyiv.
Germany is well aware of the possibilities of direct military confrontation with the Russian Federation. That is why it is deeply invested in ensuring the defense capability of the Ukrainian state and, accordingly, in the technical rearmament of Ukraine's defense forces.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force has strengthened its air defense with the new British Terrahawk Paladin weapon system. The number of units delivered has not been disclosed, but even a small batch of such systems will significantly enhance Ukraine's air defense.
For the Ukrainian side, this means creating a so-called focal air defense system to protect key logistical and military facilities from being hit by the enemy's aerodynamic means. First and foremost, this refers to UAVs. This system is mobile and accordingly can be redeployed to any location. And taking into account its autonomous use, this significantly increases the Ukrainian side's ability to counteract, as well as that of the Russian Federation.
Spain will also allocate 615 million euros to support Ukraine, the lion's share of which is earmarked specifically for military needs. In
the first place, this is a program for additional arms purchases for the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces from the United States. The second is accordingly the strengthening of Ukraine's air defense systems. And accordingly, that's the nature of it. Material and technical support, including the transfer by the Spanish side of heavy armored vehicles and strike systems that are currently in service with the Spanish army.
After the start of the full-scale war, Ukraine ramped up weapons production and the implementation of new technologies which are already being used at the front. The volume of domestic weapons production has increased tenfold.
Ukraine has scaled up the production of the Bogdana self-propelled artillery systems to 20 units per month. These are record numbers even for NATO countries. A distinctive feature is that this is a modified 155mm caliber, which is the NATO standard, plus accordingly the price-to-quality ratio. In addition, Ukraine's defense forces have increased artillery shell production, and the increase has been record-breaking. There is also a scaling up of production of both FPV drones and, accordingly, strike drones with a target range of over 1,500 kilometers.
Earlier, Volodymyr Zelensky stated that the production of domestic weapons, particularly ballistics and drones, is one of the key tasks for the government and manufacturers.
It is worth noting the scaling up of production of electronic warfare systems and radars. In this segment, once again, Ukraine's defense industry holds one of the leading positions in the world, and accordingly the production of naval drones as well.
All of this means that Ukrainian developers have demonstrated the ability to create high-precision weaponry capable of destroying important enemy military targets deep behind the front lines.
President Zelensky and Macron signed a defense agreement, which, among other things, provides for the sale of hundreds of French Rafale fighter jets to Kyiv by 2035. Next, the main news about the supply and production of weapons for Ukraine.
Kyiv is becoming a global center for the production of combat drones. Currently, Ukraine produces up to 4 million combat UAVs annually. Meanwhile, in the US, they produce less than 100,000 combat drones per year. And 4 million is not the limit of the capabilities of the Ukrainian defense industry. With sufficient funding, this number could increase several times over. This was written on his page by Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha.
The current arms race is not about nuclear weapons, but about millions of cheap drones. Whoever can ramp up production faster will secure peace. With sufficient funding, we can produce up to 20 million drones next year. Andriy Sybiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Right now, Ukraine is racing against time, both in terms of resources and technology, and the issue of increasing UAV production is a matter of survival. Ukrainian companies are not only meeting the needs of the defense forces, but are also trying to enter international markets. Unique technologies, proven in real combat conditions, are generating significant interest from partners. Some Ukrainian companies have already expanded their production not only within Ukraine, but also beyond its borders.
Ukrainian companies in Europe. Skaton has opened a facility in Slovakia and attracted over 10 million euros in investment. Flybell is preparing a joint production venture with Finland. Firepoint has received support from Denmark in developing rocket fuel for the Flamingo cruise missile systems.
The Ukrainian company TSIR is setting up a production line in Finland. Its founder, Oleksandr Hrachov, explained in an interview with Bloomberg that he is pursuing two goals in Finland. First, to ensure reliable supply to the front in Ukraine by moving part of the production capacity outside the combat zone. And second, to attract Western funding to expand production.
The war and the need to finance, develop and manufacture weapons to fight a wealthier and larger adversary have pushed Ukrainian manufacturers to exchange technologies with their European allies. Hrachov is concerned that Europe is not learning quickly enough from Ukraine's experience. In the time it took him to set up the production line in Finland, his drones in Ukraine have already gone through 3 generations.
It's not just about drone production abroad. The support of our European partners is also a key to victory in the war against Russia. Without exaggeration, a historic agreement was signed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron.
I want to emphasize the importance of this agreement. This is a strategic agreement that will be in effect for 10 years, starting next year. We understand all the fundamentals of this agreement. Political, financial, industrial. This is a historic agreement. It is extremely valuable that France is taking such a step toward achieving real guaranteed security in Europe.
According to the terms of the agreement, Ukraine will acquire 100 Rafale F-4 aircraft from France by 2035 for Ukraine's combat aviation. SAMP-T air defense systems, radars for them, air-to-air missiles and aerial bombs. Also, already this year, joint projects between the defense industries of the two countries will begin. This concerns the joint production of interceptor drones and work on developing critical technologies for Ukrainian UAVs. Building up its own air defense and carrying out systematic deep strikes on Russian infrastructure are the keys to Ukraine successfully ending the war.
Scandals and panic over the so-called Trump and Putin peace plan for Ukraine. The American peace plan consists of 28 points. It provides for transferring Crimea and Donbass under Russian control, including those territories not currently held by Russian forces, and freezing the front lines in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. The document includes a reduction in the size of Ukraine's armed forces, a legislative renunciation of joining NATO, a ban on the deployment of foreign peacekeeping contingents, and the enshrinement of Ukraine's non-nuclear status. Russia, in turn, would receive a phased lifting of international sanctions, a return to the G8 format, and amnesty for war crimes. A number of senators from both parties in the US Congress criticized Trump's peace plan. In Europe, after the publication of the peace plan for Ukraine, Trump's aide Witkoff was advised to see a psychiatrist. Reshuffles have begun. Rumor has it that US Army Secretary Dan Driscoll has become President Donald Trump's new special representative for the Ukrainian settlement, replacing Kellogg.
If Kyiv does not want to discuss President Trump's proposal and refuses it, then both they and the European warmongers need to understand this, that the events that took place in Kupiansk will inevitably be repeated at other key sections of the front. Maybe not as quickly as we would like, but inevitably this will happen again. And overall, this suits us, since it leads to achieving the goals of the special military operation by military means, in the course of armed struggle. But as I have said many times before, we are also ready for peaceful negotiations to resolve issues by peaceful means. However, this of course requires substantive discussion.
He stated that Zelensky should like this, and if not, then they should keep fighting, Trump told reporters. The head of the White House reiterated that Zelensky has no trump cards, emphasizing that at some point, especially since the winter will be cold. I spoke with their people. We have a plan. This is a war that would never have happened. I thought they should have acted faster, but it's a cold winter and many of these Yes, we have. We truly believe that we may have found a promising way to achieve peace. He has to justify it. It's so sad. Last year, they lost 25,000 soldiers. We've never seen anything like this. This is like World War II. They averaged 6,000 to 7,000 a week between the two sides. Dead soldiers, and so on. I think they're getting pretty close. I don't want to suggest that this would be one of my early actions. I've handled 8 cases involving peaceful countries, including India and Pakistan. You could even say, including the fact that they might come here in a week or two to go to Congo and Rwanda. That was 10 million people dead, and we worked on that. But so many, and the one that I think would be for me, because I have a very good relationship with President Putin, I think that one might be resolved faster. But it really gives to Tanga. And now you see all the deaths. And, it doesn't affect us, except that we don't want to see all these people. It's really on the other side of the ocean. It's a war that never should have happened. But it did happen. I'm blaming the person who's sitting right behind this desk. It's a war that never should have happened. And it wouldn't have happened if I had been president. But we're trying to save a lot of lives. We've lost. They, in particular, in the recent short period, there has been a tragic loss of approximately 25,000 lives. These casualties include both Ukrainians and Russians, who have died as a result of the ongoing conflict. This significant number reflects the heavy toll that the fighting has taken on people from both sides. And it's a joke. So why does Kyiv disagree with the terms of the document, and why have most European leaders already spoken out against the conditions of such a peace? Trump's peace plan, or rather the Witkoff-Dmitriev plan, will be discussed by Volodymyr Zelensky with Donald Trump as early as next week, according to Sky News. The day before, the Ukrainian president held an urgent phone conversation with Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Friedrich Merz. According to the media, the latter even rearranged his entire schedule for this call. But after the consultations, Zelensky posted a brief summary online. "We are working on the document prepared by the American side. This should be a plan that will ensure a real and dignified peace. There is close coordination to make sure that the key positions are accepted. The next steps have been coordinated, and it was agreed that the teams at certain levels will work together." Meanwhile, Bloomberg has reported that the EU, and therefore Ukraine, are rejecting key points of the US-Russian plan. Supposedly, European leaders are in agreement. Reducing the army is absurd. Also, the starting point for territorial negotiations should be the actual front line, and not Russia's wishes. The situation around the so-called peace plan is being rapidly pushed from across the ocean. Allegedly, the US wants a framework agreement signed with Zelensky by November 27th, right before Thanksgiving. Otherwise, according to insiders, the Americans will stop sharing intelligence and even halt weapons deliveries that Europeans are buying from America with their own money. The proposals that have been voiced, experts note that, in truth, this is a plan for capitulation. And the fate of thousands of Ukrainians like a turkey is being prepared to be laid on the holiday table. This is total capitulation. This reminds me of the 18th century. Catherine II's, the registered Cossacks, reduction of the army, armaments, reduction of range, or rather the abandonment of long-range weaponry. In other words, they're taking us back to the times before the full-scale invasion. And in addition, we are being subjected to a huge number of additional restrictions, many of which we don't even know about yet because there are a lot of behind-the-scenes clauses. With such restrictions, they could simply bring Yanukovych back and tell us to accept him in the political sphere, let him run for office because you have a democratic country. You have to push issues of the Russian language, the church, and everything else. They want to turn us into slaves and little Russians. It's interesting that it's not entirely clear who and how much will pay compensation to those affected by the full-scale invasion. The Americans supposedly agreed with the Russians that $100 billion from Russia's frozen assets would go toward reconstruction, and half of that will go to the United States. Another $100 billion is supposed to be provided by the Europeans, and the rest of the frozen assets will be invested in an American-Russian investment fund for joint projects. And that's not all. Security guarantees. They are being considered for 10 years, and the US has outlined its own terms for possible involvement in the event of another attack on Ukraine. In fact, analysts say this is the Budapest Memorandum 2.0. Back in the day, we gave up our nuclear weapons not so that people could now try to pull the wool over our eyes. These
36 hours are panic on board, an attempt to corner the only fighting democracy and show that democracy is weak, that democracy is for suckers and losers, that democracy doesn't matter. What matters is only money, murder, and cash. And then, on top of that, everyone just forgives it all. Let's see how this will be recorded on the pages of history, and whether it will be possible to build coalitions around this later while defending one's leadership.
Meanwhile, the White House press secretary stated that the head of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council supported most of the 28 points, to which Rustem Umerov posted a rebuttal on social media. He writes that he flew across the ocean only to organize preparatory meetings for future dialogue. The Americans, taking advantage of the corruption scandal in Ukraine, are putting enormous pressure on Bankova. Vladimir Zelensky essentially confirmed this in his evening address to the nation the day before.
Ukraine may find itself caught between two risks. Either the loss of dignity or the loss of a key partner. Either the very tough 28 points or a very tough winter. The gravest risks ahead are a life without freedom, without dignity, and being forced to trust someone who has already attacked us twice. They will expect an answer from us even though I have already given it.
Amidst all this turmoil, the Kremlin is watching and rubbing its hands together. There, in the best traditions of the KGB machine, they issue contradictory statements and pretend they have nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, Poland is preparing for war with the Russian Federation. Systematic sabotage in the country, drone incursions, and an explosion near Lublin. But is Warsaw ready to respond firmly to Moscow's military aggression? More on this coming up. Russia has attacked Poland.
Nowadays, the more commonly used and widely recognized term is hybrid war, and you could say that it is already underway, because, as we can see, things keep happening in Poland all the time.
Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, neighboring Poland has also been systematically under threat. And while previously it was only politicians and statesmen who spoke about a possible war between Russia and Poland, over time, these predictions began to come true. The climax came in September 2025 when about 24 Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace. A significant number of them entered from Belarus. 4 UAVs were shot down. Polish military officials stated that in September the threat from Russian drones was quite real.
Up to this point, the measures Poland is taking in response are mostly diplomatic in nature, mainly involving official channels. They have not yet shifted to a military response. But if we talk about the country's military leadership, they openly say that Russia is preparing for a possible attack on Poland, and Poland is also taking appropriate measures.
It's not just about drones. Recently, there have been several acts of sabotage on the railways in Poland. In particular, a section of track leading to the Polish-Ukrainian border was damaged. The country's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, emphasized that these were acts of sabotage. According to him, 2 Ukrainian citizens are suspected of involvement in the attacks. They arrived in Poland from Belarus and managed to escape back after the sabotage.
If the Polish authorities had managed to detain them, they would have faced rather lengthy prison sentences. These are essentially people who were willing to sell themselves to Russia for money.
Polish law enforcement is convinced that the Ukrainians were hired by Russian special services and have already demanded that Belarus extradite the suspects. This chain of events culminates in an attack on the Polish ambassador Krzysztof Krajewski in Russia's St. Petersburg. This happened when he arrived in the city to meet with Poles living there.
Poles are perceived as enemies. And they set this particular gang on the ambassador. And let's take a moment to note that the police did absolutely nothing. They just watched, simply observed, and basically smirked. It's not just a natural outcome. I'm convinced that this attack was fully planned and sanctioned by the relevant authorities, either in St. Petersburg or perhaps even in Moscow.
An aggressive group of Russian activists carried signs with anti-Polish and anti-Ukrainian slogans and attacked the ambassador because his country supports Ukraine. The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that at first there were verbal insults, but then there was a clear attempt to use physical force, which made it necessary for the ambassador's security guards to intervene. That's all for today. Julia Court, thank you for being with us. I read your comments and feel your support. Strength to the Ukrainian defenders, glory to Ukraine! Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and see you next time.